Welcome back to World War II TV, and returning after a 2-year interval is naval and aviation historian Matthew Willis to talk about the American A-36 aircraft in the Salerno campaign. His latest book, Mustang, The Untold Story, is linked in the description below, where, of course, you'll find all the information you need, links to my guests' websites, their blogs, their Twitter accounts sometimes, and indeed all the World War II TV merchandise and social media links. But without further ado, I'll bring Matthew in. Good evening, Matthew. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Aside from a recently injured back, which is causing me considerable pain. But apart from that, yeah, it's all good. Several new publications out recently, and just trying to keep on top of everything. So yeah, it's
brilliant. So with the Italian campaign, does it, in terms of aviation history, does it fall through the cracks a bit compared to the Normandy and Germany and perhaps over in the Pacific? Are people still interested?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of interest. It's probably more specific. The people who are interested in it are interested in it. More generally, it does fall between the cracks somewhat. Because then you've got like the Western Desert, which sort of comes a little bit before that, and then you've got D-Day and everything afterwards in Europe, and then I think the Mediterranean bit, North Africa first with Operation Torch, and then with Sicily and Salerno. They get a little bit pigeonholed. I think people kind of think of them as a little bit of a sideshow, whereas actually, I think they were really important, both in terms of the war, in the progress of the war itself, and also in terms of developing a lot of the tactics and strategy of air power that would then move further on into Europe and to the sort of final denouement. Yeah, and the A-36's role in that is another one of those areas where people don't know a great deal about it. There are a lot of myths about the Mustang generally, and a lot of myths about the A-36 insofar as anyone really knows about it at all. There's this idea that it's kind of a minor aircraft, that it was a sort of bit of a silly diversion from the main Mustang project, and that it didn't really do very much, which, as I hope to demonstrate over the next sort of hour or so, is completely untrue. And it's I feel a really significant aircraft that had its niche within a really significant campaign.
Well, and that's what we'll find out, because I think we're going down a rabbit hole immediately, folks, is that there's the types of aircraft that are good at lots, or pretty good at lots of things. And there are the others that are excellent at maybe one or two very specific things. And comparing them can be a little bit difficult because it's apples and oranges, And I think, when an aircraft finds its very specific niche role, but maybe wasn't good at other things, it's hard to judge it. But anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole of talking about aircraft in generalities. We're going to talk about the A-36, and I'm not going to ask you to answer this question, because I know it'll come up in the talk. But this is typical of the kind of questions coming in. Smedley, what came first, A-36 or P-51? But we will address that, I guess, as we go along.
Yeah. It's a good time to go into that, I think, because P-51. Well, I have to distinguish here, because there are a lot of different designations, and there's a lot of confusion over designations. But we should just briefly say Mustang came first, no P-51, because the British ordered it first, and it was just named Mustang. It did not have a designation for the US. When Lend-Lease started, it needed a designation, so they were supplying Mustangs to the RAF under the designation P-51. Now, the first P-51s were similar to this, with the Allison engine. They actually had 4 20mm cannon. That's the sort of second version of the RAF Mustang, and the first one that the US uses, because after Pearl Harbor, they hold on to a few of them for their own use. And out of that develops the A-36. And the A-36 is the first version of the Mustang that's developed specifically for the US Air Forces. And it's the first one that's tailored somewhat to American needs. It's very much developed from the British Mustang, but it's developed for the US, and it's bought for the US. And this model slots in before the P-51A, which is the sort of definitive Allison engined Mustang. Now, this is because of this letter A. Lots of people think that the P-51A is the first Mustang. It's not. It's the fourth model of Mustang. But anyway, that's just an aside. So, if you like, I can talk about a bit about why we get the A-36 and why this specialist dive bomber ground attack aircraft comes out of an aircraft that's chiefly known as a fighter, which was designed and developed as a fighter and went on to become one of the sort of ultimate fighters of the Second World War. Why you get this very specialist ground attack version, which doesn't seem to make any sense. So shall I?
Yeah, let's go. Let's start with that. Yeah.
Good. Right. So in early 1942, just after the US has come into the war, just in sort of really reeling after Pearl Harbor, and Germany declares war on the US, which is part of the agreement with Japan. So the US suddenly finds itself at war both in the Pacific and in Europe, which it isn't even. It doesn't. It's like it's all the way over there, and yet they're at war with them. So the Allied leaders kind of discuss this and decide that to take a sort of Europe first approach and to deal with Germany first, which is not to say they won't be fighting in the Pacific. Obviously they are, but the priority is deal with Hitler first, and then we can bring our combined attentions onto Japan. And there's a lot of discussion over what form this should take. Now, obviously, the form it eventually did take was the strategic bombing campaign, largely into sort of 42, 43, and then finally the invasion of Europe in 44, or Northern Europe. But in early 42, the US were very keen to try and get into France and into Northern Europe and to start tackling occupied Europe directly very quickly. And so their preferred plan was an invasion of Europe in probably early 43. And there were even plans to try and do this perhaps in late 42. If it looked like the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, then there was talk of trying to do it in late 42. So the focus is now on battlefield stuff, tactical air fighting, rather than strategic air fighting with lots of heavy bombers. But the problem is the US is severely lacking in tactical battlefield planes of the kind that we now know from the European war will actually do the job. They've got several that they've got kind of in hand. So there's a modification of the naval Banshee dive bomber, which is probably not going to cut it on the battlefield in Europe. They've got several sort of larger, more powerful dive bombers, which are struggling in development, and they're either going to be late or they're not going to be good enough. So there's things like the Brewster Bermuda, as we call it, Brewster Buccaneer, the Curtiss A-25 Shrike, and there's questions over these sorts of aircraft, and they're mired in development difficulties. So there's a need to get something that's good and high performance, but can do that very pinpoint strike army support job quickly. Now, fortunately, we have a situation where we're just about getting the Mustang into service in Britain. We've done all the testing and development on that, and what we now know about it is that it has very good performance at low level. It's very stable at low level. It has excellent range. And it has pretty good lifting ability. It has enough sort of spare lift that it can heft a bit of ordnance. So this is really the window that both North American are looking for, because they're probably not going to be allowed to make any more Mustangs for the British, while all the priority is rearming the US Air Forces. But also it helps the US Air Force, US Army Air Corps as it is at the time, out of a hole, because they're missing this big chunk of aircraft in their armory, and they rush this through. There's no normal development program of the sort of formal kind that attends a new aircraft coming into service, partly because we know a lot about the Mustang already. Dutch Kindleberger, who's a sort of top dog at North American, and a great salesman, persuades the US Army Air Corps that he can provide them with the aircraft they want in double quick time without too much fuss. And really, there's this interesting window of time. We go on shortly after this to fighter bombers, which are more or less just fighter style aircraft with bombs hung on them, and very little sort of other modification that you need to do. Right at this time, we're thinking we need dive brakes so we can do proper dive bombing, proper vertical dive bombing like Stukas do, because the Stuka is still casting kind of a long shadow after the war in Europe. People are still thinking about using the aircraft in that kind of way. So they fit the dive brakes, and you can see in the picture here on the slide, you have these slatted dive brakes above and below the wing. And these were actually more or less ripped off from the Vultee Vengeance, which was another one of these kind of hurried dive bombers that were put in production initially for the French. Then the British took them over. Then the US kind of thought about buying them and did buy some, but ended up not putting them into frontline use. They were only used in training. But they did furnish their dive brakes to the A-36. So if we go to the next slide,
just quickly to talk about the French there, because
yeah,
they're often overlooked in sort of development and in terms of doctrine of aircraft type, because they, the conversation started in a sidebar about the A-24, which wasn't really used in the ETO, but the French had 40 or 50 or something like that. So was it the case of the French getting stuff that they was all they had spare, the Allies had spare, and then the French kind of doing things with them, and then the Americans looking at what the French were doing, go, oh, that's quite good, or were the French contributing? Just briefly kind of explain the kind of the French involvement generally in this, not just with the A-36, but generally with American aircraft types.
Well, I think, to an extent, the French were just buying anything they could get their hands on.
Yeah.
There really was this phase when they were just really buying anything. They were buying things like the Vought Vindicator. They bought an export version of that, which is another Navy dive bomber, which was kind of getting to be obsolete. It was a slightly older version than the Dauntless, the Banshee, the Army version of it. But it wasn't that great a dive bomber, but the French bought some, and they were developing some of their own as well. So there was I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head now, but there was an interesting French dive bomber in development, which just about saw some service in 1940. It was a thing with gull wings and an inline engine and twin tail, I think, possibly. But yeah, so the French were, dive bombing was part of their doctrine. Particularly again in the Navy, but I'm not sure how much time. Certainly the war in France did have a very big bearing on how the US then developed their air forces, and there was a realization that a lot of the stuff they had and a lot of the ideas they had weren't really good ones. So the idea of using twin engine bombers like the A-20, thank you, Luan Newport.
There's always someone in the sidebar.
Yeah.
Or a quick on their fingers on Wiki. One of the two.
Yeah, no, that is the one. It's an interesting looking thing. Do look it up. So using things like the A-20 for tactical battlefield use was probably not, in a highly contested airspace, was not going to be very successful. So there was this, from out of the Battle of France, did develop this idea that you really need high performance aircraft. So, you look at how the ferry battles and the Westland Lysanders and things like that, and how they fared in the battle space. There was this idea you need something that's fast, tough, and can get in and out, really before attracting the attention of too many enemy fighters. And can handle itself if the fighters do come along, but also is capable of this very specific, very pinpoint bombing. We'll get on to this other stuff later, which is the doctrinal argument between close support and distant support, and actual battlefield support and interdiction behind the battlefield, which again, the A-36 ends up doing both brilliantly well. And it's really the perfect aircraft for all of these various doctrines, because it can just turn to whatever you want it to. But we will get there.
Yeah, and just
So
yeah, that basically, what do you do ground support? What is a debate that was raging even till
yeah,
45, but they kind of got it sorted out by then, and it's
yeah,
certainly a debate still raging amongst historians. You know, you look at
totally.
North Africa and
Yeah.
even out in the Far East, what was happening there. It's basically, you know, the as you said there, the Americans and the Brits have a kind of a pre-war idea about how air war will go, and have been building and
Mhm.
designing for that. And then the air war that actually kind of unfolds isn't quite what they're expecting. And we're
Yeah.
seeing in 42 and even in 43, the stop gaps not quite the right word, but the bridging between the earlier ideas to the eventual kind of by 44, 45. We've got aircraft coming out that are much better suited to where the thinking has been going, but the middle period is fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. And the A-36 is slap bang in this middle period. And it's the first one, I think, that can, well, obviously you have the Hurricane in the Western Desert, and and P-40's doing a bit of this kind of stuff. But I think the A-36 is really interesting because it's the last one of the vertical dive bombers that can actually do a very steep dive onto the target from sort of medium altitude, and these kind of hedge hopping fighter bombers, which are not so accurate, but are they can bring the battle in other ways. So it's and again, the A-36 can kind of do both, and it does. But yeah, the idea of sticking dive brakes on a laminar flow wing, which is sort of is rather bizarre, but they just do it. North American does it partly, I think, because they want to keep the Mustang in production. The USAAF does it because it wants to. It needs this aircraft for these campaigns that it thinks are coming up, which in the end don't transpire in the same way that they expect them to. But in the end, they get this aircraft in their lap in about the numbers that are useful. I mean, they order 500 A-36s, which is obviously tiny in the context of all the Mustangs that are built in the course of the war. And yet, I think I feel it has an importance that really outstrips that. And bear in mind as well that they serve in both the Mediterranean and in the CBI, the China Burma India theatre. So they're in use in these two specific theatres, and there are only 500 of them built, but they do they're really in the thick of it for this pivotal part of the campaign. And so they're sort of developed throughout 1942. The idea is that really this is the only way that the Air Corps, the Air Force, as it becomes, can get an aircraft of this type into service before the end of 1942, when it thinks it might need it. And of course, by the end of 1942, we're no longer talking about invasion of France anytime soon. But with the action has moved down to the Mediterranean. So November 1942, you have Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, and then so the idea that we're then squeezing Rommel from both sides, and that they will be able to deal with the Axis in North Africa on two fronts, and then by summer of 1943, by sort of May 1943. Both A-36s are starting to arrive in theatre, and Rommel is dealt with, and we're starting to focus on Sicily and then mainland Italy. So we've got two groups equipped with the A-36 in this theatre, and they are the 27th. Well, I'll call them the fighter bomber group. They start off as bombardment group, light, and then they go through several changes of name, and then they finally settle on fighter bomber group, but I'll use that for clarity. The 27th and the 86th fighter bomber group, and both of those have 3 squadrons each, and they run from the 520. Hang on, I've got it written down. 522nd to the 527th. So 27th has the 522nd, 23rd, 24th, and the 86th has the 25th, 26th, 27th.
Right.
And they get to North Africa May 43. Then you started to get attacks on Pantelleria, which is one of the smaller islands in the Mediterranean, and they use this kind of, partly they want to take it out because it'll be on the flank when they go into Sicily, and partly it's kind of an experiment in how to attack islands and how to do these kind of campaigns. So they start off using the A-36s. 6th of June is the first one, and it's just a reconnaissance over Pantelleria. And the 7th of June is the first offensive mission, and they're dive bombing gun emplacements because it's very heavily fortified, Pantelleria. And they're starting to develop tactics around this time. So you see heavily defended targets. What they do is they dive bomb they tip over into the dive from 10,000 feet, and they aim to recover at around 4,000 to 5,000 feet. For lightly defended targets, they're tipping into the dive at sort of 6,000 to 8,000 feet and recovering on the deck, which is obviously more precise. But the technique for a higher dive leads to more. It's still fairly precise, and it leads to, it's far more survivable against heavy flak. So yeah, and so that's the 27th go into action, just sort of 6th, 7th June, and early July the 86th goes into action, and that's they start. This is on Sicily itself after the invasion of Sicily, and they're dive bombing Panzer Division. So they're very much using them as Stukas would have been used, as very much dive bombing in squadron strength against frontline battlefield targets. And initially they start to sort of show quite effectively, really, from the very beginning. Now,
and
so,
Andreas is asking what bombs were they using when they started, and did that evolve? Did the types of racks and types of armaments change as that progressively?
The typical load was 2 500-pound bombs, so a 500-pound bomb under each wing. They could carry smaller bombs, obviously, but the main load overwhelmingly was a 500-pound high explosive bomb, or I think they had semi-armor piercing ones for, but they didn't tend to use those. It was just the standard high explosive bomb generally. But yeah, 500-pound under each wing, which wasn't huge in the context of later. What things like the P-47 could carry, but it was it was pretty effective against most targets that they were attacking.
Brilliant, thank you.
That's fine. So if we go to the next slide, actually. Yep. So this is an A-36 in North Africa, just after they arrived. So again, you had those markings then with the yellow stripe on the wing and the yellow band around the roundel, and the markings would evolve as the campaign went on. This one has just arrived in theatre, and the next one, which this is a radio photo. So it was one of these photos which the poor quality of it and the lines on it is because it was transmitted. They could actually transmit the photos via a news wire, and it was like an early sort of digital photo, I suppose, although it was completely analog. It was transmitted over the news wires. And this was the first picture that went out of A-36s going into action. So this is in an airfield in North Africa, about to take off to attack targets in Sicily. Sicily, can talk a bit about the kind of things they were doing in Sicily. So let's see. So communications was a big part of it. So rail transport and road transport. So 6th of July, they were attacking, I think, a railway station on that day, railway yards, factories and warehouses as well. But transport did become something of a theme. Now, on the 10th of July, the 526th Squadron loses its commanding officer. Captain Winters is shot down, and actually several of the commanding officers will be lost over the succeeding campaign. Is that, you know, they weren't just sitting at a desk, they were really in the front of it. And obviously it was quite a dangerous line of work, because, you know, low level, there were not a great deal of enemy fighters around at this point. There were some. Air to air wasn't the main threat, but ground certainly was. There was an awful lot of flak, and obviously at those altitudes they were flying, small arms could be a risk as well. So yeah, Captain Winters was shot down by flak. Yeah, so by the 14th of July, advance parties were moving to airfields on Sicily. They'd captured enough territory that they were starting to form. They were taking over some airfields and making temporary airfields on Sicily. So they were starting to stage over from North Africa onto Sicily, and actually taking on raids directly from there, and sometimes I think flying back to North Africa after a day's operations. But obviously they could just fly so many more sorties if they were not having to cross the sea first.
And do they have any of the groups have any of their kind of own autonomy in this? Because I mean, we're not talking about a massive great force. We're talking about in this, you know, build up post Sicily. There's lots of most things in theatre, navy, air, ground. There's not many of these. So are they getting sort of direct, specific orders of you will hit railway lines only on the 3rd, and or are they allowed some kind of freedom of what the pilots are getting good at, and sort of targets opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment it's generally very specific. So it's you know, they're given, particularly when the army is advancing and it's advancing quickly, then quite often it's, we need this thing knocking out right now. And this was another thing that the A-36 got very good at, because of its performance and its ability to be accurate. They could really get targets allocated at short notice and go straight there, particularly when they were staged, you know, when they were at the temporary airfields on site, and they could just go and hit it straight away. And at this stage in the war, it's very much very directed. It's very specific targets. The army is in touch saying we need this, this, and this hit, or, you know, before an advance, they'll be saying these particular things can be, we need them knocked out, or you have gun emplacements here, or you have, this is an enemy HQ here. And it was all very directed. Later on, it would become a lot more freewheeling, and there would be more of a sense of, here is an area and we need you to harass enemy communications within that area.
And that's generally how ground support is evolving. Is, you know, does the tail wag the dog, or vice versa? You know, that's been a lot of the problem in North Africa, is the army requesting that air support do things that the air support aren't particularly good at doing, and the air support suggesting things to the ground that they can do well, and that kind of this not quite agreeing on things, and you know, by Sicily, you know, we did some shows, and I would argue things are getting a little bit more coordinated in terms of, we can do this and we're good at doing this. But yeah, it's interesting how you have to be adaptable. I mean, that's in this bridging period, everybody's got to be able to kind of, you know, take stock and say, this isn't working, let's do this a little bit differently.
Yeah. And I think because you have the Northwest African Air Forces as the sort of umbrella of the tactical air forces that they're using, that are involved in this campaign. And I find that you've got this really interesting fusion of lessons from the North African camp, from the Western Desert, and from those sorts of campaigns. And you've also got lessons from the British at home, and there is tactical documents which are turning up in the Northwest African Air Forces documents, which are lessons from the British in Army Cooperation Command using the Mustang from the beginning of 1942, and the kind of stuff that they're doing against Axis communications, so trains, river transport, road transport, and they're ranging all over occupied France, Netherlands, even into Germany, and cutting communications and hampering communications, and also a lot of tactical reconnaissance. So you're learning a lot about enemy troop movements, enemy movements of resources between places. and that's all feeding into what the A-36s are doing as well, because it's a similar aircraft to what the British are using. And there are actually at this point as well RAF squadrons that have come out into theatre. 225 squadron had been a Mustang squadron. It came out to North Africa on Spitz, and then actually borrowed some Mustangs from the US and was carrying out shipping reconnaissance and stuff like that. And you also have 1437 flight, which is a strategic reconnaissance flight, but they borrow A-36s from the Americans, and they're doing a lot of low-level reconnaissance. So there's this kind of constant interplay of information between the different forces, and particularly the attacks on communications that the A-36s do later on after the Salerno landings, which I apologize we haven't got to yet. I'll get to them quick smart. But they bear a lot of resemblance to what the British are doing in France, Holland, Germany. And obviously that's playing into, because, you know, in a sense, Sicily is a lot more like France, Holland, Germany than the Western Desert is. So there are these there's this fusion of learning that comes out, and I think there's this idea that, you know, tactical air power was invented in the Western Desert, and it came through into Italy and Conningham and Tedder and all that stuff, whereas actually a lot of it was developed in Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe, and the two kind of come together around this time, and that's my view on it anyway. And actually, yeah, I mean, in terms of the sense I get from the A-36s and from their war diaries and from their combat reports is that in terms of the combat stuff, what they don't like having to do is initially over Salerno, what they're doing is top cover over the beaches and providing combat air patrol, and also a little bit escorting bombers, and that's the stuff they don't like. All of the sort of air to ground stuff, they don't seem to have a strong opinion as to whether, you know, they're equally happy doing pinpoint stuff on the front line, hitting targets that the army want them to hit, and they're equally happy doing casting wide over the road and rail nets, shooting up trains and road transports as they see them. I don't get any sense that they think we should be doing this, we shouldn't be doing that. And it's only when they start bringing them into the air-to-air role just before Salerno that you start to hear a little bit of griping. But you know, once they're on Sicily and they're developing this again, they're doing a lot of you know, both supporting the army and, you know, hitting the sort of stuff behind the lines. And so where are we? We're sort of into August, really. Sicily's kind of a done deal.
Yep. And
they're looking towards Italy itself. If we could have the next slide, actually.
Yeah. And there's been various questions about the 50 cals and how many there were, 6 on American and 4 on British, and whether they should have been taken off if they're doing ground attack, and does it affect the weight, does it affect the performance? So people are really interested in the machine gun aspect. So if you want to kind of give us your 2 pence on that, that would be most welcome.
Definitely. Okay, so 6 50 cals on the A-36, which is right. Start from the beginning. So the Mustang Mark I, the first combat Mustang, has 4 50 cals and 4 30 cals. And that's intended as an air-to-air fighter initially, but you know, that's what British want. 8 guns, they give it 8 guns. It's a mix, that's fine. The Mustang 1A has 4 20mm cannon, which the Americans regard as overkill, and they're struggling. They're having all kinds of struggles with the production of the 20mm cannon at this point anyway, so it's not really a favoured weapon. The Navy like it, the Army not so much, but they really like the 50 cal. And the 50 cal is, I think, particularly the RAF Mustangs find that the 50 cal is a good compromise weapon for the kind of stuff they're doing. So for shooting up road transport and trains, thin-skinned targets, it's very, very good. And for trains, it's very, very good. And because it's enough to go through and there is these quite kind of slightly gruesome reports where slightly gloating reports where they're talking about how good the 50 cals are for train busting, because you riddle a train's boiler with those at full steam pressure, and it blows the fire back into the cab, which is not terribly popular with train drivers. So there was a report at one point that that the Axis was struggling to recruit train drivers in the areas where they were getting attacks from Mustangs, because it was not a nice end. But yeah, I mean, for the 50 cal is a pretty good ground attack strafing weapon. Now, we do see on A-36s that some of them, I think slightly later in the campaign, start to remove the chin guns, because they've got 4 in the wings and 2 in the chin position, firing through, synchronized. And we do see them start to remove the nose guns. So whether that's a question of performance or load, loadout or something like that, it's not clear. But obviously they felt that the balance was reasonably good. Obviously, the next US version after the A-36 was the P-51A, which just had the 4 50 cals, and then the P-51B and C had 4 50 cals, and then they go up to 6 again for the D, and then back to 4 again for the H.
To jump in terms of the research for your book and what have you, which covers this, is that the P-51D, for example, later on, there must be a huge amount of resources available of pilots reporting, because they were, as you said, they produce in much bigger numbers. Is there much information? I mean, people are asking, did the pilots enjoy flying, and what are the performance, capabilities? What is it good at? What is it bad at? With 500 aircraft produced and a limited number in theatre, and the fact that some of these pilots, I'm assuming, went on through the war and didn't make it through the war, is there much archived information of things like performance and what they feel about them?
Yeah, I mean, performance first. There are some pretty exhaustive testing reports, both from the British and from the Americans, and from so Wright Field, where they do the sort of experimental testing, and then Eglin Field, where they do all the tactical testing. And there were some good detailed tactical testing reports from Eglin. There are some sort of more intelligence-based reports, as I say. So where we have there's a good and a very detailed report from a US colonel who goes and interviews British pilots about their use of the Mustang, and so that sort of feeds through. I mean, in terms of performance, it was really very good, and there was nothing else to touch it at low level. Particularly the A-36, which was it was a real hot rod, because its engine was optimized for very low altitudes. It gave its maximum power at like 3,000 feet, so it was really optimized for that low level role. The RAF Mustangs Mustang Mark 1s were a little bit higher. This, I think, about 12,000 feet was maximum power. The P-51A had a slightly higher rated engine, so that was kind of up to medium altitudes. But really, there was very little that could touch them at sort of say below 10,000 feet, and particularly for the A-36, kind of 5,000 feet. Really, it was very much optimized to that low level. And it was very popular. The pilots did like it a lot, and pilots tend to get attached to their aircraft, and you see this sometimes where pilots love a certain aircraft and they really resist getting the replacement, and then they get the replacement and they love that too. But certainly what you see with the A-36s is when they have to start replacing them, it's not because the aircraft isn't doing the job anymore, it's because the airframes are running out. And because they only built 500 of them, it's out of production by the time they're arriving in theatre to start with.
Right.
So it's a finite time they're going to run out, and they do start running out in sort of by summer 1944. They're getting low on them. Well, before that, even really by spring 44, the squadrons are starting to sort of, some of them are replacing them and kind of handing them over to the other squadrons, and they're kind of husbanding them, the remaining airframes. And then by sort of summer 44, they're replacing them fully. But the squadrons that have to replace them with the P-47, they're really not happy. They really think their A-36s are the absolute best thing in the world for the job that they're doing, and they really resist having to take over this kind of big ugly thing that they come up with all kinds of derogatory nicknames for. And that's written in the war diaries. It's very some of these war diaries that from the 86th group in particular, they're not like the British war diaries. There's a lot of personality in them. There's a lot of kind of information beyond the just the bare bones, which you tend to get in the British reports. There's a lot of kind of more human stuff, which and the sense I get from it is that they love their aircraft, and the only downside of it really is the bomb load is maybe a little bit small. The P-47 can lift a lot more weight, and so when they come to things like bridge busting, it's less effective than something that can carry bigger bombs. It's certainly in terms of, obviously its headline figures don't look that good because aircraft that produce their best speed at low level tend to be they're not as fast as, because the air is thinner higher up, so top speeds are higher up. But certainly compared with everything else, I can post figures afterwards. I don't have them in my head, but certainly we're talking about sort of the high 300s, which low down is very, very good. And certainly the Allison engine Mustangs generally outperformed the Merlin engine Mustangs at low altitudes. So it's sort of anything up to sort of maybe 8,000 feet, let's say. It's better in the Allison engine Mustangs, and actually they had nicer handling too. The Merlin engine Mustang introduced a few kind of handling slight irregularities in certain regimes, whereas the Allison engine ones were very well optimized and they just handled very sweetly. The only slight
there's lots of people, Trent Alenko and others, are answering their own questions in the sidebar about the Allison engine. Whether it's such a knowledgeable bunch on here. So it mostly, as people ask a question, it comes up and is answered either by you naturally or it's answered by themselves. But my prep for this, I was looking at some website where they compared the P-47 to the A-36, and I'm thinking, well, that's not fair, is it? I mean, because it wasn't available till later. I mean, if you've only got what you've got, comparing something that comes along months later, it's a pointless argument, isn't it? It's like comparing the Abrams of today with the Sherman of World War II. Of course, it's better. It's later. I know that's an extreme example, but the A-36 is what it was when it was, and I think that it's key to get back to its. And the fact, to me, as a kind of more of a person's historian rather than tech historian, the fact the pilots didn't want to give it up, it tells me a lot. And as I say, the fact that it was replaced entirely because the airframes were wearing out and getting shot down and so on, rather than because it had become obsolete. I feel I'm derailing you from your talk, so I will shut up.
Let's get on to Avalanche. In the build up to Avalanche, again, the A-36s they're really quite in there, but not quite in the role that they were. I mean, partly in the role they were expecting, but partly into other roles as well. So the 22nd, they're escorting B-26 Marauders from Termini Imerese over to Salerno, which is a run of about 200 miles. So they're doing longish range escort, which there weren't the fact that this is a fighter bomber group. They're very attack focused. They turn to the air-to-air stuff. They're not desperately happy about it, but they do it, and they're actually pretty successful. So the 86th group is supposed to be escorting a lead box of B-26s. The 27th is supposed to be escorting the aft box, but they don't, for whatever reason, they fail to make contact with the bombers, and they don't get involved. They're attacked by 109s and Machi 202s over the target, and here the A-36s start to get some air-to-air kills under their belt as well. They actually prove to be certainly at the kind of altitudes they're operating at, they're pretty effective against enemy fighters as well. Yeah, so I saw someone earlier point out actually P-47 very expensive to make. Yeah, it was about, I think it was about 50% more expensive than a Mustang. But anyway, yeah. So there was an interesting sort of sideline on this actually on the 24th of August. The 525th Squadron, they're supposed to be dive bombing a rail yard, and as they're on their way, the CO spots some ships in a cove, some warships, and he's thinking, well, they would make a pretty good target, but radio silence. I'm not going to pull the, and obviously we've been given this order. We have to hit this particular target that we've been given. So he makes the decision to hang on to his bombs. And because he's leading, so he can't, he can't say, he can't wave the others through and not go down himself. So he leads the others into the dive with his bombs, keeps his bombs on as he pulls out, which is, he's in danger of pulling the wings off his aircraft. But, they do that. They bomb the rail yard successfully. And then on the way back, he finds these ships again, dive bombs them and sinks one. And they identify it as a destroyer or a cruiser. It's actually it's slightly smaller. It's a sloop. It's like a corvette, but they sink it, and so ship busting. They add to that, and this is on the 24th of August. So again, that's kind of versatile. Right. So into September. So we've got the landings in Calabria at this time, and we're just building up 6 days away from the landings in Salerno. And at this point, while the dive bombing another rail yard, I think it is at Lamazia, Captain Striegel is killed. So he's the CO of the 525th. So this is now 2 squadrons of the 3 in the 86th group have lost their CO during this campaign, and we haven't even got to Salerno yet. So this is kind of a big blow, but they carry on. There's no sense, I think, that the 525th is any less effective from here on out. Striegel is replaced he is replaced by Major Gunnison.
Right.
But as the main invasion begins, they're pulled away from their attack role, which they're good at and proud of, onto just providing top cover for the beaches. And partly why they're again, this is kind of square peg in a round hole a little bit, partly because there aren't enough fighters with the range to do that from Sicily. You've also got the British have brought a load of Woolworth aircraft carriers with Seafires on to try and provide top cover, but they start crashing those at an alarming rate. So it's difficult to provide enough top cover for the beaches. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous work. Not so much because there are a few hit and runs from Luftwaffe, but also from friendly fire. There's one incident where some P-38s are mistakenly vectored onto a patrol of A-36s, and one of them shot down, which is pretty tragic, but it's the kind of thing that happens. Again, you get this notion that the A-36 looks like a 109, which I don't see it myself, but you hear it throughout the war. There's this notion that the Allison engine Mustangs look like a 109, so they obviously, from certain angles, maybe it had the same kind of posture. I don't know, but
maybe it's more because there's fewer of them, so it looks different. Maybe it's more that than it is that it actually resembles it. I don't know, but
that's probably a good point. Actually, is that it's just less familiar, obviously something like a P-38 you can't mistake. But yeah, that's a good point actually.
No, I made a good point in an aviation show. That's I have to write that one down.
Cool. And so what's the next slide? I should know that.
Next one is the
here we go. So Captain Striegel, who I mentioned, is he's the guy in the mid. There's no point me pointing at the screen. No one will see that. He's the guy who's in the back row behind the guy in the cap, the
Right.
peaked cap. So that's Captain Striegel. So these are the A-36 pilots from the 86th group. This is when they're in Sicily. But you know, so there's I can give you names if you want names.
Yeah.
All right, where are we? So left to right, so right to left in the front row. So kneeling is Lieutenant Webster, then Captain Bland in the cap. Oh no, sorry, they've ordered this on. So the guy at the right with the Purple Heart is Lieutenant Webster. Captain Bland squatting, Lieutenant Batten in the cap, Lieutenant Jackson in the forage cap. Then in the background you have right to left Lieutenant Hood, Lieutenant Striegel, Captain Striegel, Lieutenant Rutherford, and on the far left in the peaked cap, in the baseball cap kind of thing, Lieutenant Green. Now Green, Striegel, and Hood were all shot down and had to bail out over Sicily, and you know, they recovered and got back to their squadrons. And then obviously Striegel was shot down again just before they went into Salerno. So you know, that was it was dangerous work. It was dangerous work, and you know, there was a steady attrition. Yep. So back to Salerno. After a few days of this top cover on the beach, they are allowed to start doing ground attack missions again, which is what they're good at and what they want to be doing, really. So there's and they start also to do this kind of ranging inland and sort of hitting more targets of opportunity. So on the 11th September, they're doing the 527th is doing an armed reconnaissance inland, and they find a row of Junkers 88s preparing to take off, and they shoot them up, you know, they do quite considerable destruction. But they're also doing, again, sort of army support tasks of, you know, gun emplacements, you know, that when the sort of artillery is identified and they're called in to do strikes on targets around the beachhead, you know, so they're doing these three major tasks as the invasion happens, which is, you know, I think it really demonstrates their flexibility, that they can switch between these roles, and that they're doing all of them effectively, really, and that there's a relatively limited number of aircraft. You know, we've got 6 squadrons, you know, involved here. And so there's a line from George Hicks, who was a reporter for the Blue Radio Network, who was actually embedded with some troops at the time, who did a report, you know, more or less from behind a hill while the A-36s were going in to dive bomb a target in front of the troops. And he said the A-36 is credited with saving the Sele River front at Salerno by its pinpoint dive bombing of troops, gun positions, and truck lines. And obviously, you know, that's propaganda, but I think it does give you some indication of just how prominent the A-36 was within this campaign. And by the 15th, they're actually operating from Italy itself. So there's a temporary airfield that's established at Sele River near Paestum, where they're operating there. And again, they're doing the same thing as they did on Sicily. So they're staging in from Sicily, operating and doing a number of sorties a day, because the front line is very, very close. They're, you know, almost there and back within minutes, and then flying back to the they've just got an advance echelon at the temporary strip, so it's really, you know, basic maintenance and refueling facilities and things like that, rearming. Right, so where are we? So again, there's a lot of you know, so for example, on the 16th of September, they find another Luftwaffe airfield and shoot up a load of you know, 20 to 25. Actually, they dive bomb the Messerschmitts. You know, they happen to just turn up over the airfield as there's an assembly of 109s, and they actually dive bomb them, and they estimate that they destroy 20 to 25 of these on the ground with bombs. So you know, it's kind of precise work. A few days after that, 20th, they're back to the actual front line of the battlefield. There's reports of forces assembling for a counterattack, and they come in and they break that up, and break up the counterattack completely, and the army's very happy with them. And through the war diaries, you get these, periodically they're getting the sort of messages of thanks from the army on the front line, which I think does give some indication of how effective they were at this real close support stuff, which I know it's kind of unfashionable that there's this sort of the war is evolving towards this distant support and interdiction, which they will move into, but they were very effective at the close support stuff, and it did actually seem to be making a big difference.
And you mentioned that the army seeing what they're doing. I know you meant the army kind of a broad term, but I mean one of the things about the Italian campaign, the Salerno campaign particularly, kind of the general going back to the penny packeting idea that they kind of had half moved away from earlier. Now they're back into it. I mean, we're talking about American 1st Armored Division on Sunday. One combat command comes in, the other one doesn't come in for weeks and weeks later. And so are they attached at kind of the 5th Army level? Do they work at corps level? How are they used, the two groups? Is it sort of changed day by day? I think of like tank destroyers in Normandy, where one day they're attached to one division, the next day they're attached to a different division and a different corps. So how does it kind of work?
I get the impression it's more at army level,
right.
But they're directed as the particular units on the ground are needed. So I think it is more. It's at a higher level than that. But there is obviously quite a lot of communication going on, and it's quite time sensitive.
Yeah, I mean that to me is, I mean, we're going down another rabbit hole. It seems to be the strength of, again, it only being two groups, is that if you're trying to bring something to bear, of the size of the 8th Air Force, for example, it can take a bit of time to get those wheels to turn, because there's lots of sort of stages of communication to go through to get to the right people. But with a relatively small force, and the nature of the Salerno campaign is swift changes, trying to maintain operational tempo, things like that, there's no point putting a request in for ground support and it coming back 3 days later. You need it kind of in 10 minutes time. And so it seems to me that that's their strength in some ways, is that they're kind of immediate quick response firefighting team.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, someone's just in the comments mentioning identification, aircraft identification, which there is at one point they're asked to fly over the front lines. This is slightly later in the campaign, but they're asked to fly over the front lines at a reasonably low level, so the forces there can see them. So that they know that our own aircraft are going over there to hit the enemy, and then of course they get shot at by their own side as they're flying over. So they like, no, we're not doing that again. We're going over at 10,000 feet. Thank you very much. But yeah, certainly they. On the other hand, there are reports of them hitting targets very, very close to friendly troops. And where there's absolutely no room for for error in in the traditional sense, in the sense that it's meant in of an error greater than really yards rather than hundreds thereof. And there are plenty of reports of they have to do this because the troops are so close to each other that they can't afford to make any mistakes. So I think this is what's interesting from reading about these two groups. And as you say, it's the fact that they're relatively small units, and they're all based at more or less, most of the time, each group is based at one airfield. So it's they can operate together pretty well. Group headquarters is there, and they can operate the group almost as a single unit rather than as disparate squadrons. Yeah, I think it's a nice organizational size to be flexible and to be responsive, and it does seem to be very responsive. Certainly at this stage of the war, when it does, you got a very fast moving fast-moving battle. And later on, when it settles down somewhat, things change, and things become a bit more broad-ranging, and it they can fight in a different way. But
in fact, I'm going to invite you back for our Anzio week, probably next January, and
okay,
to continue this conversation, because it's only really a few months later. But the rules of engagement are very different. The tech is very different. The campaign, I would definitely put Anzio in kind of in a chapter break. It's a different era. This is maybe kind of still the end of the Torch Husky era, but I would say that the Anzio era is definitely marked by particularly the P-47 starts coming into things later on. We can do that there. But I'm just inviting you for that now, so we can.
Oh, great, thanks.
Because that's going to be exciting. So
no, I think when you get to there's a definite sense of Winterline and Anzio is kind of different to the initial Avalanche operations. And things do evolve then to a lot more of the communications attacks. The attacks go a lot further. They're going up to Rome by this point, and it's very different to this initial phase of very short missions to right to the front line or very close beyond it, and attacking very specific targets that are requested by the army rather than something a lot more free ranging. So I see we're 8 o'clock already. Do you want to sort of wrap things up in terms of?
Let's give it another 10 minutes or so, and we've got a few more slides to go, and I think we are answering the questions as we go along. But that of the photos you sent, that's kind of my favorite one. I don't know why. Just the color, partly. It's one of those photos that kind of, this is my interpretation of it, demonstrates that sort of connection between the pilots and the aircraft. It feels like it's all part of that. I feel you can tell they like their aircraft from that photo. I don't know whether I'm reading more into that because of what you said, but
it's potentially. It's a good one. I included it because it's so nice and evocative. And this is stateside because you've got the buzz number on the nose. So it will be in training or working up for operations. It's not directly related to Salerno in that respect, but it's just a great photo.
It is superb one.
The contemporary color is good. But I just and you've got the Vesuvius there, which you'll see erupts later on. And but can I just wrap up the talking about the operational stuff with this just report from October 43, when there's as they're evolving more into this kind of attacks on communications, which they have done throughout, but this one's right. So this is Lieutenant Colonel Tarrant of the 527th, and they're attacking railway targets. The four of us went in on the deck, as was customary, and flew over water until time to turn inland and begin looking along the road nets in that territory. We then saw an enemy troop train, which apparently had about 1,000 soldiers on it. From my position in the flight, it was impossible for me to get my guns on the cars, so I pulled to one side in order to give the leader of the second element a better shot without having to worry about hitting either me or my wingman with his bullets. Both he and his wingman raked the train and covered at least 3/4 of its length. Just ahead was another small station into which I fired about 300 rounds with no apparent damage except what could normally be expected. At this point, the leader of the second element had dropped behind, and again I moved over to give him a shot at the station ahead. This is normal procedure, as it not only gives all members of the flight a shot at some of the targets, it spreads the expenditure of the ammunition in such a manner that all the ships have some left in their guns in case they are jumped by enemy fighters. I watched him turn onto the target and saw his traces going in and around the boxcars. As I turned my head to look at the front for another target, there was a terrific explosion. The first sensation I had was that the whole side of the airplane was gone, and that something had hit me quite a blow on the side of the head and face. After being stunned momentarily, I came to enough to realize that the sliding panel of the canopy was in my lap, and that the left side of the ship was still apparently intact. I looked back just in time at about 500 feet to see a ship come out of the explosion, roll over onto its back, and head straight down. Its guns still appeared to be firing. The target must have been quite a large ammunition dump. The blast and concussion were not comparable to anything I have ever seen before, and the smoke and flame went up to at least 3,000 feet. My own ship was at an altitude of approximately 200 feet and at least 300 yards to the right of the station. The impact was so powerful that it practically caved in the right side of the airplane. The wingtip was creased and dented, though nothing struck it. The removable panels to the cowling were caved in, and the stramer to which they were attached has bent. Along the aft section of the fuselage, the skin was pushed in, and most of the bulkheads had been bent. The vertical stabilizer had been strained, and the rudder moved about 1.5 inches to one side. The horizontal stabilizer and elevators had been sprung out of trim. In spite of this damage, all the controls were only slightly sluggish and stiff in their reaction. Upon reaching the airfield, a normal landing was made without any difficulty. So there you go. And that just gives you a flavor of the tactics they used. It gives you a flavor of the sort of targets they hit and the sort of the risks. You know, there are quite a few reports of people being damaged by their own explosions, essentially. And it gives you a sense as well of like the kind of damage that a 50 cal can do if it hits something like that. You know, we were talking about 50 cals earlier, and you know that's all they were using. And the strength of the airframe and the sort of what a good flying machine it was, that it could take that amount of punishment and still get its pilot home. So, you know, all hail the A-36.
No, definitely, and if you were giving a sales pitch to make a movie about it, you would have succeeded. I mean, it is an aircraft that is perhaps misunderstood and badly maligned at places at times, but you know, it's we often talk about in this channel. So we tend to favor things from the end of the war because things were better and bigger, and they are the ones that survive. We've probably all seen, you know, later Mark Spitfires fly, but we haven't necessarily seen the earlier flight types fly and things like that. And so, you know, we've all seen a P-51D, but how many have seen an A-36 fly? And so it's, you know, we tend to think about the popularity of those late war aircraft. But we've got a couple more photos to go. And if someone's already said they're paper mache fuel tanks, question mark.
Those aren't the paper mache ones. Those are actually, I mean, this is, you know, we won't get onto it in this episode. I'll bring that back for the Anzio one and Casino if we're mentioning that. But this is when they were actually using the combat tanks, the aluminium ones, as for supply drops. And this is they're loading up the tanks for the supply drop, and the photo on the right is dropping it to troops that are cut off. So where was I? What were we talking about? Oh yes, seeing an A-36 fly. There are a couple in the US. There's one, the Friedkin Foundation, is beautifully restored, and that's representing an aircraft from this campaign, and it's you get a chance to see it fly, because it's just gorgeous. There was another point I had in mind, but I have forgotten it.
We've got a few questions for you, maybe while you're remembering.
We'll go on to the name eventually, but yeah.
Yeah, and they've got those last couple of pictures of the posters or illustrations.
Yes. So on the left there you have Yank pilots named it Invader, and on the right A-36A Mustang, and I've included those because of the notion, which, you know, a lot of us are trying to deal with, which is this A-36 Apache notion.
Yeah, I made the mistake of provoking you by mentioning it in the messages with you, because, well, unless it is a mistake, unless I'm boring everyone rigid by talking about it, but yeah, it's still very widespread. I think the idea is getting through a little bit more that it's kind of a myth. A few years ago it was so widespread that even the USAAF museum had Apache on the display board for their own aircraft. You know, there are model kits, you see the accurate miniatures ones, they're all A-36 Apache. There are books of A-36 Apache, never used, never applied to the A-36 specifically. In fact, this arose from an error in an article in Air Classics in around about the 1970s, and then that was picked up by Squadron Signal, and in Squadron Signal's book, which obviously everyone bought at the time, and from there on in, it was just so hard to challenge it. An entire generation of young aviation buffs read that, and then that's it. That's become
and even like I was sort of talking about this to someone the other day, the Accurate Miniatures kit, Accurate Miniatures actually knew that was incorrect, but it was so prevalent that they put it on the box anyway. They had a historical correspondent that said, actually, it wasn't called this at the time, but they were like, everyone knows it as that. We'll put it on the box.
And it sounds sexy. It's going to sell models. It's going to sell books. You know.
Now there is. I won't go into it now. There is a history between the name Apache and the Mustang, but it doesn't relate to the A-36. It's all dead and gone by the time the A-36 comes along. It was just a mistake.
But we'll do a few questions. Sorry.
Yep. No, I was going to say there was a semi-official name, Invader, which obviously the A-26 is officially called that, but the name Invader, there was a guy called Lieutenant Walsh from the 86th group who decided to they had a bit of a discussion, think we should have a name for our aircraft because it's something different from the Mustang, and this got into the media and they reported it as, we want to call it Invader because when the invasion comes along, our ships are going to be right in the thick of it. There it went, and it even got as far as there was a US War Department recognition guide that had P-51 Mustang, and underneath that in small writing, dive bomber version known as A-36 Invader. And there are cabinet office reports that you find from the British government that have Invader in it. It got really, really widespread. But anyway,
I mean, thank God they didn't give it to the British public to vote for the name, because they'd have called it Flighty McBang Bang or something, wouldn't they? So we've got a couple of questions, each of which is potentially a long answer and a short answer. But first one is basically about the book. So Robert is asking, does Matthew's book give detail about the development of the Mustang in addition to the operational info?
Yes, it does.
Well, that's a nice quick answer.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And Great Dominion is asking, was fitting the Malcolm hood on the A-36 ever considered as a means of improving pilot vision, particularly to the sides and rear of the aircraft?
It would have done if the A-36 had been in service for any longer. Right. I think the US prioritized the Malcolm hood on their earlier Mustangs for tactical reconnaissance, whereas the British prioritized their Malcolm hoods for fighters. I think probably because of the nature of the A-36, the fact that it was on the deck, the intention was to get in and out before the fighters even got there. I think it would have been last in the queue for Malcolm hoods. I mean, it was a general improvement anyway, but I haven't seen anything in the literature about the A-36 specifically, but probably mainly that's because it was starting to go out before before the Malcolm hood came along in detail. Oh, thank you, Robert. That's very kind.
And now I've started a thing where now people are going to come up with alternative British-inspired names now. So that's my fault, folks, for doing that. You talked about the possibility of seeing one flying, but Terry Emery is asking, are there any in aviation museums as well? So just static ones?
Yes, I believe there are. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. Again, in the book, there is a list of survivors. There are some around. None in the UK, unfortunately. Mostly, I think, probably all in the US, as far as any Allison engine in Mustang variants. But there are a handful of them still around because they used them in air racing after the war. So there were 2 or 3 A-36s that were used in the sort of Bendix air races and so on. So that's why some of them survived when really it was an obsolete aircraft that by the end of the war that probably would have all been in line for scrapping. But because they were very fast at low level, they were great for air racing. So that was...
Makes sense. And a good question because, as a Normandy guy, we talk about yabos all the time. So, but that's sort of a generic kind of catch-all. It can mean the P-47 or the P-51 or the Typhoon. So Sean Brennan is asking, have there been any reports of what the Axis thought of the A-36 specifically, or does it kind of come under the umbrella of those cursed Allied aircraft?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't read a great deal. There were a couple of sort of anecdotal things from. There was a mention of when Air Vice Marshal Conyngham went to see the 86th and 27th group and give them a bit of a pep talk. He mentioned how the Italians told them that the Germans didn't like being strafed by them. So how much you read into that, I don't know. That's all very third hand. There is a really intriguing little snippet, which was from an Allied rest center in, now, was this the one in Amalfi or was it the one in Capri? I think it was probably Amalfi. It was a little bit earlier. So this is where the pilots went off to have a bit of rest and recuperate from when they go back into action, and they had some local women provided for them to keep them company and just to be nice to them, there was actually a German woman who was within this at the Allied Rest Centre in this sort of entertainment facilities, and she was going on a date with a pilot whose name I forget, but his nickname was Big Dog. But anyway, and this guy started to get the impression that she was actually probing him for intelligence. And at one point, she asked him over dinner, "So is it true that the A-36 can dive absolutely vertically?" And at this point, he kind of clams up. So I think, again, very anecdotal, but I think there is a sense that they were aware of it. But I haven't seen a great deal of Axis reporting on it, and that's something I will be very interested to read. But other than those couple of bits and pieces, I haven't seen any direct indication. But okay, I think it will be interesting.
Well, thank you for that. And I think what we will do is we will leave it there, and we will pick up this conversation, but morph it into something else when I invite you back for the Anzio week, because it's that progression, development, changes, all those words. Look at it, and over the course of this series, I'm creating. We did the Husky week, we're doing the Salerno week, we'll do an Anzio week, we'll do a week or two on Monte Cassino. I think at the end of it, hopefully, theoretically, touch wood, there'll be quite a resource of how the Italian campaign. 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes, but there are lessons that can be learned from it, and there's an aspect of the history there that I think is rather overlooked, because as soon as it gets to June 6th, everyone's attention just switches to France, and before there's other things going in the Pacific as well. And I think for me, James Holland certainly said this week, and he's written his 20 books now, the one he most enjoyed writing was his latest book about the Italian campaign, because there's so many avenues you can go down, so many examples of things going well, things going bad, and he had an absolute whale of a time writing it. So I think those of us, I'm slowly becoming an Italian campaign kind of fan, really, and I'm finding it's fulfilling a lot of need in me for different types of investigation. There's so many things going on. So
I really enjoyed it, researching it, writing about it, and I really want to go back to it. I think there's more to be said. I'd like to look more into P-47s and P-40s and stuff like that. So it's but the A-36 is researching it really sold me on it. And it wasn't like I wasn't like, I love the A-36, I'm going to go and write a book about it, because obviously the book's not entirely about the A-36, but it's substantially. It was very much that when I was looking into it and I was reading the contemporary sources and thinking, my God, this is really good and really effective, and it did a lot. So I think it's definitely something that I'm going to kind of evangelize about, but it's more important than it's given credit for.
No, I think that's going to be anyone who watches it. That's going to be the takeaway. Is if they had heard of the aircraft or if they hadn't heard of the aircraft, it was there doing its job, pretty flexible, got results, and the pilots loved it. And I think that tells a lot. So, Matthew, it's been great talking to you. Folks, I'm not anywhere tomorrow night apart from the pub, but Friday we are back with Lawrence Peterson, who's going to be talking about the Hermann Göring division, which is another complicated one to discuss because it's an armor division, but it's got paratroops in it. If you don't know anything about it, it's a complicated one. Then shows over the course of the next few days, and I'm still scheduling more as we go. Thanks for becoming a patron, those of you who have. Consider becoming a YouTube member, and don't forget to go and buy Matthew's book, link below. So cheers, everybody. You hold up a copy. Oh, here we go. There we are. Hold up the copy. Put it on your screen. There we are. Mustang, the Untold Story.
That's Italy there. Yeah.
Fantastic. So there we are. So cheers, everybody. See you on Friday. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV. So enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.